those alive during 9/11, what was the worst moment on that day? The jumpers, a haunting descent into despair that defined 9/11. For those who lived through the tragedy of September 11th, one of the most harrowing images that would forever be seared into the collective memory of the nation was that of the people jumping from the burning towers. It wasn't just the act itself but the devastating decision they had to make that left witnesses utterly broken. Many recount how, in disbelief, they watched in real time as individuals leapt from the inferno, their bodies falling through the sky in what seemed like slow motion. This heart-wrenching choice, whether to burn alive or plunge to certain death, was too much for many to process, even years later. It was a silent scream, a visual that needed no words, and it struck to the core of every viewer's soul. These memories still haunt many today, resurfacing as a symbol of human desperation in the face of unimaginable tragedy. One person shared that they were only 9 years old when they first witnessed these jumpers, and how their teacher, as if by instinct, made them duck under desks in an attempt to shield their innocent eyes from the horror unfolding on the television. Another witness, only 16 at the time, sat paralyzed in a classroom, watching in disbelief as one person after another jumped. They described this scene as an unshakable part of their memory, a visual they wish they could forget, yet know they never will. The sight of those people, strangers, making that final decision is etched into their psyche, burning or falling, their only options. A teacher's dilemma, protecting students from the worst day in American history. As the towers burned and the country reeled from confusion, some teachers made a split-second decision to protect their students, not just from a physical threat, but from the emotional toll of what they were witnessing. One individual shared the story of their teacher, an elderly woman who instinctively ordered her students to duck under their desks. At the time, it may have felt like another safety drill, but in retrospect, the person realized it was likely an attempt to shield their young minds from the unspeakable images on the screen, images of people falling from the towers, images too brutal for young children to comprehend. But not every classroom was so lucky. A 16-year-old recalls sitting in a chemistry class, where the TV was left on for everyone to see. What was supposed to be another ordinary day of school turned into a nightmare as they watched, live, the devastation unfold. The scenes of the jumpers, people forced to leap from the towers, became not just news but a personal trauma. The weight of what they witnessed became too much to bear, leaving an indelible mark on their soul. These teachers were caught between wanting to protect their students and being too overwhelmed themselves. Some turned off the TVs, while others left them on, paralyzed by their own shock. The chaos of that day was not just in the skies over Manhattan, but in classrooms across the nation as young people were introduced to a harsh new reality. The firefighters' hell, the dreadful echo of bodies hitting the roofs below. For those brave enough to run toward the inferno on September 11th, the experience was unlike anything the world had ever seen or could ever imagine. In the chaos of trying to save lives, firefighters set up command posts inside the towers, and as they climbed the stairs, their ears were assaulted by the sickening sound of bodies hitting the roofs above and the glass below. It wasn't debris or wreckage, these were human beings, choosing to jump rather than burn, their bodies creating a horrifying drumbeat of death. The sound of those thuds was inescapable, a cruel reminder of the desperation just above their heads. One responder recounts a documentary where firefighters heard these dreadful thuds while setting up at the base of Tower 2. Each sound was a life lost, each thud marking a soul that had leapt from the upper floors. And yet, despite this unimaginable distraction, the firefighters pressed on, determined to save as many as they could. Another witness to this unspeakable horror added that bodies didn't just hit the roofs, some crashed through the glass pavilion below. The sound of shattering glass, mixed with the impact of human bodies, was something no one could prepare for. The trauma that these first responders endured was not only physical but deeply emotional, etched into their hearts forever. Sacrifice in the line of duty, the firefighters who paid the ultimate price. Among the fallen heroes of 9/11 were those who were tragically killed not by the collapsing towers or the fire within but by the very people they sought to save. In one heart-rending story, a firefighter on the ground was struck and killed by a jumper. This was not an isolated incident. Every corner of Ground Zero was filled with both unimaginable danger and unspeakable tragedy. These rescuers were running toward the chaos, knowing that each step could be their last. For many, it was. One responder shared the story of the first official death of a firefighter that day, a chaplain who was killed by debris as he honored those who had fallen. He removed his hard hat in a moment of respect, only to be fatally struck. The chaos was unforgiving. In another gut-wrenching detail, it was revealed that flaming jet fuel had poured down the elevator shafts of the towers, engulfing the lobby in a fireball that consumed everything in its path. Survivors who made it out described the scene as apocalyptic: bodies charred, debris scattered, and destruction so complete that it seemed as though a bomb had gone off. And still, the rescuers pressed on, determined to do what they could. The unbearable choices, facing death from every side. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of 9/11 was the impossible choice so many faced that day. For those trapped in the upper floors, the decision to jump wasn't made lightly. It was a choice between a slow, agonizing death by fire or a swift, terrifying fall to the streets below. Witnesses describe how this realization left them shaken to their core. The thought of having to make such a choice was incomprehensible to those watching from their TVs, and yet it was the reality for so many. One witness recounted that they couldn't stop thinking about those who jumped for weeks after the attacks, the image replaying in their mind every night as they tried to sleep. The helplessness they felt, knowing they could do nothing but watch, was something they've never been able to shake. Another individual recalled how seeing those jumpers live on TV fundamentally changed who they were. It wasn't just a moment of tragedy, it was a moment of transformation, where the world lost its innocence, and humanity was forced to reckon with the depths of its own vulnerability. The two holding hands, a picture of love in the face of death. Of all the images burned into the memories of those who witnessed 9/11, one stands out as particularly heartbreaking. Among the many jumpers, one person recalls seeing two people holding hands as they fell, choosing to face their final moments together. This image, of love and connection in the midst of unspeakable tragedy, became a symbol for many of the resilience of the human spirit, even when faced with the worst horrors imaginable. The person who witnessed this was only 10 years old at the time, and yet that memory has haunted them every day since. It wasn't just about death, it was about the human desire to find connection, even in our darkest moments. It was an image of tenderness in the midst of terror, and for many, it became the emotional anchor of an otherwise chaotic day. This shared descent, hand in hand, would forever symbolize both the tragedy and the beauty of the human condition. The silent devastation, when everyday life was scattered across the streets. One of the most poignant memories shared from that day wasn't just the collapse of the towers, but a shot of a nearby street strewn with what seemed like mundane debris, papers, documents, fragments of the ordinary office life that had once existed within the towers. The absence of visible bodies made it no less heart-wrenching. For one person, this image brought the weight of the tragedy crashing down. The papers were not just scraps. They represented the everyday lives of thousands whose existence had abruptly ended. It was a scene that conveyed the devastating loss in a way that words never could, a street filled with remnants of people who would never return to their desks, never finish that last email, never see their families again. Personal fears collide with national horror, losing both parents in 6 months. For some, 9/11 wasn't just a national tragedy, it became an intensely personal nightmare. One person recalled how they had already lost their mother earlier that year and spent September 11th in sheer terror, thinking they were about to lose their father, too, who was at the Pentagon when the attacks occurred. As a sophomore in high school, they sat numbly with their classmates, watching the horrific news unfold, all the while wondering who they would live with, how they would manage to keep their house, and how they would even afford food. The weight of those hours, spent waiting in fearful anticipation, was unbearable. Thankfully, they returned home to hear their father's voice on the answering machine, alive and well, which led to tears of relief, but the emotional scars of that day remain. In an instant, childhood ends, a 12-year-old's realization that life would never be the same. For many young people, 9/11 marked the end of innocence. One person, only 12 at the time, recalled how they instantly knew that their life, and the world they had known, was forever changed. In that moment, as the towers collapsed, something as simple as their understanding of the world was shattered. There was no going back to the days of carefree childhood, no more simple times. They saw, with a clarity that few adults even grasped at the moment, that the world had shifted on its axis, and from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. The fearful smoke trails, witnessing the collapse from Astoria, Queens. One individual, living in Astoria, Queens, that day, recalled the eerie sight of smoke rising from the sky. They followed the trail of smoke until they saw one of the towers engulfed in flames. This was before cell phones were everywhere, so there was nothing but speculation and mounting fear about what had happened. They took the subway to work, and by the time they arrived, the second plane had hit. Subway service was soon suspended, leaving them stranded in the city, but their boss wouldn't allow anyone to leave the office, prioritizing safety above all else. With the phones down and panic in the air, their fiancé kept them updated as the news of more potential hijacked planes spread. When the towers finally collapsed, the devastation felt personal. The next day, they ventured into the city, which was eerily quiet. The tension was palpable, and the feeling of fear lingered in the air like a toxic cloud. Waking to a new reality, shock, rage, and disbelief in Miami. Imagine waking up late, unaware that the world had irrevocably changed. One person, living in Miami at the time, worked the night shift and had slept through the morning chaos. They woke up, showered, and headed to work, only to find the office closed. Furious that no one had notified them about the cancelled meeting, they stormed back home, oblivious to the fact that one of the greatest tragedies in American history had just occurred. It wasn't until they opened their laptop and saw the headline, "People running from the burning towers," that they began to comprehend what was happening. Switching on the TV, they caught a replay of the plane crashing into the tower. Time seemed to stop as they sat in disbelief, glued to the screen for the rest of the day, trying to understand the unimaginable. From childhood to war in a heartbeat, a 15-year-old's vision of the future. For one 15-year-old, the events of 9/11 were more than just a tragic moment, they were a terrifying glimpse into the future. As they sat in a deserted hallway at school, trying to call their mother on a payphone, they envisioned their 17-year-old friend, a high school senior, boarding a plane to fight in a war that had not yet been declared. This chilling foresight, fueled by a deep understanding of history, haunted them as they realized that everything in their life would now be divided into before and after. Their life, and the lives of their peers, would never be the same. 23 years later, that same friend is now their husband, having gone to war several times. The long shadow of the war on terror would follow their generation, stealing their sense of security and replacing it with a new world of fear, racism, and division. The millennials' burden, a generation changed forever by September 11th. In the eyes of one witness, 9/11 wasn't just a day, it was the defining moment that changed an entire generation. As a millennial, they remember the attacks not only for the immediate horror but for the long-term effects that followed. The war on terror, the surge of patriotism, the rise of racism and xenophobia, all these things shaped their coming of age in a world that was suddenly much more dangerous and divided. They recount how their friends and loved ones were forever altered, both by the attacks themselves and by the wars that followed. They saw firsthand the impact of combat on the minds and bodies of those who served, and they witnessed the division within their own country, as fear and hatred became the tools of choice for those seeking to make sense of the tragedy. Desperate hope, the images of loved ones held high in Manhattan. Another memory that will never fade is the sight of people running through Manhattan with photographs of their loved ones, holding them up for strangers to see, posting them on fences, and clinging to the hope that someone, anyone, might recognize the faces in those pictures. The sheer trauma and desperation of those moments were overwhelming. The streets were filled with grief-stricken people, frantically searching for the missing, their faces etched with fear and loss. The futility of the search didn't make it any less heartbreaking. These were their families, their friends, and they were doing everything they could to bring them home. Witnessing death in real time, the fall of bodies from the sky. For those on the ground near the towers, the sight of people falling from the burning buildings was the ultimate horror. One individual recounted how, from just a few blocks away, they saw bodies plummeting to the ground before being told to run north, away from the collapsing towers. The trauma of witnessing such a thing firsthand left them shaken in a way that words could never fully describe. These weren't just images on TV, they were real people, and their deaths were not abstractions but visceral, brutal realities. It was a moment that would haunt them for the rest of their life. Rising from innocence, the moment war became real for high schoolers. It was an ordinary day of tests in high school, until it wasn't. The horror unfolded live before their eyes, as they watched the second plane strike the tower. That's when the collective realization dawned: this was not an accident. This was an attack. And then, just as swiftly, another thought struck, a heavy, sobering truth. War was no longer a distant idea, it was coming. The future they'd envisioned was shattered. In a heartbeat, young students, still filled with dreams, found themselves signing up for what they knew was a long, brutal road ahead. It was a moment where innocence was lost, and the world suddenly seemed much darker. The elementary school that shielded them, a bubble of silence amidst catastrophe. While the world watched the unfolding tragedy, one elementary school stood as a bubble of silence. The students there were kept completely in the dark. All day long, they carried on, blissfully unaware of the life-altering event taking place. One child went home, still believing the attack had happened the night before, only to be confronted by the stark daylight behind the towers when they turned on the TV. The realization hit like a freight train. The world they had woken up to that morning had irrevocably changed. A mother's tears, the unbreakable woman brought to her knees by fear. A 14-year-old girl stood frozen, watching her mother, the strongest person she knew, break down in tears for the first time. The second plane had just struck, and her mother, gripped by fear, wept as she imagined her son, the girl's older brother, being drafted into war. They lived in Los Angeles, and her mother didn't even feel safe driving her brother to school that morning. The terror wasn't just of the unknown, but of an all-too-familiar dread, that their world, their family, was about to be torn apart. Voices from the void, the heartbreak of missed calls and final words. In the chaos that followed the collapse of the towers, cell networks were overloaded, leaving families in torment, waiting for word from their loved ones. The following day, voicemail messages began to trickle in, some hours or even days old, from people trapped in the towers. The cruel twist was that many of these messages gave their loved ones false hope, that they had somehow survived, when in reality, those voicemails were their last words. The silence that followed each call was deafening. The jumpers, a descent into desperation and the inescapable horror. For many, the worst moments of 9/11 were not the explosions or the collapsing towers, but the people who jumped. There was no greater image of pure, unfiltered desperation than watching those souls, trapped with no escape from the inferno, leap from the towers. Knowing they would not survive the fall, they still chose it over being consumed by the flames. For those who witnessed it live, the sight has never left them. It wasn't just tragic, it was the stuff of nightmares, a haunting image that replays endlessly in the minds of those who saw it unfold. The eerie quiet of the day after, a world gone silent. The day after the attacks, the world felt wrong. Planes were grounded, streets were empty, and people barely spoke above a whisper. In the Northeast, candles lined the streets in front of homes, quiet tributes to the lives lost. Missing posters went up on walls and bulletin boards all across New York City, desperate pleas from family members searching for loved ones in the wreckage. In the silence, grief hung heavy in the air. It was as if the world had been plunged into a collective mourning, a grief so profound that words could not do it justice. The false calm, apocalyptic predictions that never came true. For those watching from outside the United States, 9/11 was a global spectacle of fear and uncertainty. One viewer, from afar, remembers how news channels around the world were filled with apocalyptic predictions, many speaking of a potential World War III. Yet, as horrific as the events were, that war never came, though the scars of that day would ripple through the world in countless other ways, reshaping the geopolitical landscape forever. It was the beginning of an age defined by fear and anxiety, where nothing seemed certain anymore. We were supposed to have good lives, a friend's devastating realization. In the aftermath of 9/11, one high school senior turned to a friend and uttered words that would echo through the years. Things were supposed to be different for us. We were supposed to have good lives. It was a sentiment felt by so many young people at the time. Their futures, once filled with promise, were now overshadowed by fear, anger, and uncertainty. The world that they had been preparing for had changed overnight, and in its place was a reality they could never have imagined. A scent of fear, the terrifying silence in a world without planes. For those living near airports, there was one haunting reminder of how much had changed after September 11th, the silence. Airports, once bustling with life and constant activity, were now still. The sky, usually filled with the hum of planes, was eerily quiet. For one person living near DFW Airport, the absence of that noise was almost more terrifying than the attacks themselves. It felt like the entire world had come to a standstill, suspended in that moment of fear and uncertainty. The firefighters' alarms, a chorus of lives lost in the rubble. In the days following 9/11, as the search and rescue teams combed through the wreckage, one sound became synonymous with loss: the chirping of the past devices worn by firefighters. These devices, designed to emit a sound if a firefighter stopped moving, became a grim reminder of just how many heroes had been lost in the collapse. The constant, haunting beeps echoed through the rubble, signaling lives cut short in the line of duty. It was a sound that many who were there would never forget, a shattered sense of safety, the moment we realized we were at war. For many, the moment the second plane hit was when the gravity of the situation fully set in. This wasn't an accident, it was an attack. And with that realization came another, even more frightening thought: this meant war. The United States had been attacked on its own soil, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that the country would retaliate. For so many, that day marked the end of an era, a day when the sense of safety and security that many had taken for granted was forever shattered. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment and follow for more stories.